The night had settled over the airfield like a heavy velvet curtain, swallowing the distant hum of the city. Lights from the hangars cast long, trembling shadows across the cracked tarmac, and the cool wind carried a hint of ozone, the smell of machinery and rain-slicked metal. She walked alone, her boots scuffing against the concrete with each deliberate step echoing in the vast emptiness around her. There was a kind of reverence in the silence, a waiting, as if the air itself anticipated her arrival. Her eyes, sharp and restless, scanned the silhouettes of parked aircraft. Most of them were small training planes, unremarkable and still, but at the far end of the field, in its own fenced enclave, stood the Apache. The helicopter seemed alive in the darkness, its angular frame etched in moonlight, rotors poised like the wings of some great predator. Its metallic skin glimmered faintly, reflecting the pale light in a way that made it look almost organic, like a creature hiding beneath a mechanical shell. She had seen Apaches before, in museums, in movies, in the glossy pages of military magazines, but this one exuded a presence that transcended its technical specifications. It did not feel inert. It felt aware. She stopped a few meters from it, her breath catching in her chest. It was ridiculous, she knew, to speak to a machine, to imagine it capable of responding. But loneliness had a way of twisting logic, bending reality until the impossible felt ordinary. "You're sleeping with me tonight," she said, her voice low but unwavering, carrying across the tarmac. The words sounded stranger out loud than they had in her head, yet they did not falter. There was a defiance in them, a demand not just from her lips but from the depths of a heart that had grown too quiet, too unused to being heard. The Apache remained still, but she imagined it tilting its rotor blades slightly, the faint whine of its systems rising and falling in acknowledgement. She imagined it deciding to grant her request, not out of obedience, but out of curiosity, a willingness to bear witness to her solitude. The notion was absurd, yet comforting. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that it could feel her presence, that it could understand the ache of emptiness that had chased her for so many years. She approached cautiously, trailing her fingertips along the cold, hard surface of the fuselage. The metal was smooth and surprisingly warm under her touch, humming faintly with residual energy. Each joint, each rivet, seemed to pulse with potential, as if the Apache were holding its breath, waiting for her to prove that she belonged here, that she had crossed the threshold of the ordinary into something unknown. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with anticipation, the same anticipation one might feel standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to leap into the dark waters below, trusting instinct more than reason. Her gaze traveled upward, following the lines of the helicopter's sleek body to the cockpit, where dark glass reflected her own wide-eyed expression back at her. In the reflection, she could see herself as she truly was, a solitary figure draped in the trappings of normalcy, yet trembling with the urgent need to reach out and connect with something, anything that could acknowledge her existence. She whispered again, more softly this time, almost a plea. "You know I need this. You know I need you." There was no answer, not in words, but there was a presence, a weight in the air that pressed against her chest and made her shiver. It was a tension that was neither threatening nor comforting, but charged, alive. And in that instant, the loneliness that had always clung to her seemed to bend, folding into the shadows and the hum of machinery, as though the world had narrowed to the two of them, herself and the Apache. For the first time in years, she felt seen not by a human, not by a friend or lover, but by a sentinel of steel and shadow that bore witness to her audacity, her vulnerability, and her desire. She settled onto the ground beside it, feeling the vibrations of the engines through her fingertips, feeling the faint warmth radiating from the metal, and let herself exist in that liminal space between fear and intimacy, between reality and the unthinkable. Outside, the night pressed in, indifferent yet protective, enclosing them in a bubble where the ordinary rules of the world no longer mattered. Tonight, she thought, tonight nothing else exists. The wind had softened, carrying with it a faint scent of wet grass and distant asphalt. But the woman remained seated beside the Apache, her gaze fixed on its angular form. To anyone passing by, it would have appeared absurd, a grown woman crouched in the shadow of a war machine, murmuring to herself. Yet in her mind, this moment was entirely sensible, the culmination of years of quiet desperation and unspoken longing. She had always been alone. Not the lonely because she chooses solitude kind, but the kind of isolation that crept in gradually, wrapping its cold fingers around her heart until she barely remembered what connection felt like. Her family had dispersed into lives that no longer intersected with hers. Friends had drifted away, consumed by work, marriage, children, or distractions she could not match. Relationships, fleeting, fragile, often disappointing, had taught her to retreat further into herself. But the ache never dulled. Loneliness was a constant companion, a whispering shadow that reminded her she existed, but only as an observer, never as a participant. Her fascination with machines had started early. As a child, she would spend hours dismantling her toys, marveling at the intricate dance of gears, levers, and springs. There was a purity to machinery that human beings lacked. No deception, no judgment, no heartbreak, just function and occasionally elegance. As she grew older, her attention had turned to airplanes, then helicopters, and finally to the Apaches she'd seen in military magazines. The sleek, lethal machines seemed impossibly alive to her, their power both beautiful and terrifying. In them, she saw something she rarely glimpsed in people: reliability, purpose, and the promise that they could withstand the chaos of the world without complaint. Her obsession wasn't entirely rational. She spoke to inanimate objects, left notes for broken devices, and imagined conversations with engines that would never start. But it wasn't delusion, it was survival. When the world refused to hear her, machines would listen, at least in the fragile, private theater of her mind. And tonight, she had brought herself to the apex of that obsession, standing before an Apache as if it were capable of understanding her in ways no human ever could. Apache itself carried a history that intrigued her. She had read about its service in distant deserts, its participation in conflicts she could scarcely imagine. Pilots had trusted their lives to its strength, maneuvering through chaos and danger while relying on the machine's precision. And now here it was, a survivor of war, dormant yet potent, stationed on this quiet airfield far from the battles it had known. It was a paradox, a war machine capable of destruction, lying still and waiting, and a woman capable of tenderness and fear, reaching out with her trembling hands. Their meeting was improbable, yet in that improbability she sensed a kind of destiny. A collision of need and potential. As she traced the lines of the fuselage with her fingertips, her mind wandered further into memory. She remembered evenings spent staring out bedroom windows, dreaming of skies she would never fly, of adventures she would never take. She remembered the sting of rejection, the quiet disappointment of failed friendships, the ache of standing at the edge of gatherings and feeling invisible. And she realized that in her fascination with the Apache, there was more than admiration for machinery. There was longing for strength, for protection, for the certainty that someone or something would be there for her, unflinching and unwavering. She whispered into the darkness again, recounting fragments of her life as though the Apache could absorb her history. I've been quiet for too long. I've been small for too long. No one sees me, and I just want someone to care. The words felt ridiculous even to her, yet she could not stop speaking. There was no one else to hear her. The night, the field, the old hangar, they were witnesses. But even more than witnesses, they were accomplices in a strange ritual of confession and hope. somewhere deep inside, she knew the Apache would never respond in the way a human might. It could not smile, it could not speak, it could not embrace her. And yet, there was something profound in this act. She had dared to reach out, to declare her desire for connection, to imagine that a silent, unfeeling object could answer her need with the faintest acknowledgement. In that, she felt the first stirrings of transformation, not the transformation of the machine, but of herself. And so she sat, speaking into the night, letting her loneliness pour into the metallic form beside her, until the world narrowed to the single improbable truth. She was no longer entirely alone. Night had thickened over the airfield, pressing down on everything with a weight that was almost tactile. The city beyond was a distant hum, insignificant and far away, and the wind had dropped to a whisper, leaving only the occasional creak of metal from the Apache. She stayed close, crouched beside it, letting her hands trace the cold, angular lines of its fuselage. There was an intimacy in this gesture, a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. Fingertip along rivet, palm over rotor shaft, hand pressed against engine housing. She whispered to it in fragments, confessions, questions, laughter, tears, treating the machine as a confidant, a partner, a lover. "Do you remember them?" she asked softly, pressing her forehead to the glass of the cockpit. "The people who flew you? The places you've been?" There was no answer, only the faint vibration of residual energy beneath her fingers. Like the echo of a heartbeat she could almost feel. She imagined that it could see her, understand her loneliness, and in some impossible way choose to accept her presence. The thought was preposterous, yet comforting. For the first time in years, she felt the raw, unguarded vulnerability of someone willing to reach out completely and hope to be received. She circled the Apache, examining every detail, the curvature of the rotors, the ridges along the fuselage, the faint scratches that told stories of past missions. She imagined the pilots who had sat in that cockpit, trusting the machine with their lives, whispering to it just as she did now. And then, in a sudden, absurd moment, she laughed a soft, trembling laugh because in some strange, impossible way, she felt as though she were joining a long line of confidants, partners, and caretakers. She was part of its history, even if only in her imagination. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had lost its meaning. She leaned against the Apache, letting her body mold to the curve of its frame, and spoke of her loneliness, her regrets, the hollow ache of years spent unseen. "I've spent so long talking to walls, to empty rooms," she said, "and now it feels like someone or something is listening." The vibrations beneath her hands seemed to pulse in acknowledgement. It was not a conscious response, she knew, but it was enough. Enough to convince her that connection was possible, even in the most improbable of forms. At one point, she climbed carefully into the cockpit, feeling the hardness of the seat beneath her and the cold metal controls beneath her palms. She imagined the Apache as alive, not in the sense of thought, but in the sense of presence-aware, watchful, protective. She allowed herself to close her eyes, leaning back against the seat as though it were an embrace, as though the machine could cradle her as no human ever had. And for a fleeting moment, she believed it could. She drifted into half-sleep, the boundary between herself and the machine dissolving. Dreams and reality intertwined. She flew over deserts and oceans, her hands on the controls, the Apache responding perfectly to her touch. She was free, soaring, untethered from the weight of solitude that had bound her for so long. In that strange liminal space, the machine became a mirror of her desires, strength, companionship, and the sensation of being understood without words. Hours later, she awoke to the first faint light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The Apache sat silent, unchanged yet profoundly significant. She touched it one last time, pressing her palm to the metal with gratitude and something akin to love. It had not moved, had not spoken, had not responded in any literal sense, but it had held space for her. And that was enough. Rising to her feet, she felt an unfamiliar lightness in her chest, a sense that she had crossed a threshold. The night had been intimate, not in the way human intimacy might be measured, but in the way that mattered most. She had allowed herself to be wholly seen, wholly vulnerable, and had been met with acceptance, if only from a sentinel of steel and shadow. And as she stepped away from the Apache, the first rays of sunlight catching on its angular frame, she realized something profound. She had not spent the night with a machine. She had spent it with herself, finally daring to inhabit the loneliness she had carried for so long, and in doing so, had found a strange and fragile form of companionship. The morning sun filtered through the hangar windows in thin, golden shafts, painting the Apache in a glow that made its metal body seem almost alive. She lingered at the edge of the tarmac, watching the play of light on its fuselage, feeling the residue of the night settle into her bones. Something within her had shifted. The loneliness that had once weighed her down like a leaden cloak now felt lighter, softened by the strange communion she had shared with the machine. It was not as though the Apache had spoken or moved in response. The machine remained silent, impassive, a sentinel of steel. Yet she could not deny the effect it had on her. The night had revealed something she had long forgotten, her own capacity for courage, for desire, for intimacy, even if the intimacy had been with a construct of metal and machinery. She realized that connection was not only found in others. It could be discovered within herself, in the act of reaching out, of daring to trust, of allowing vulnerability to exist without judgment. Her fingers lingered on the cold metal of the rotors, tracing their arcs as if they were part of some intricate language she could only understand through touch. She felt a reverence for the Apache that was almost religious, not for its mechanical function, but for the way it had borne witness to her night of confessions, dreams, and half-sleeping flights of imagination. It had stood still, and in doing so, it had offered her a mirror, a reflection of what she had always desired, but rarely allowed herself to claim. As she moved around the helicopter, brushing away dust and loose leaves from the tarmac, she noticed the small details she had overlooked the night before, the faint scratches along the fuselage, the tiny dents in the armor plating, the worn edges of the cockpit seat. These imperfections, signs of past battles and long service, now seemed like badges of resilience. And in them, she saw a lesson for herself. Endurance did not mean perfection, and vulnerability did not mean weakness. She, too, could carry scars without shame, could exist fully even with the weight of past wounds. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. Her shoulders, once hunched with the burden of solitude, felt freer. Her gaze, previously cautious and inward-turning, now held a glint of curiosity, of willingness to engage with the world. The night had not erased her loneliness, nor had it magically given her companionship, but it had given her something more essential, the courage to exist fully, to claim her own space in a world that had often overlooked her. In a strange, almost imperceptible way, the Apache seemed different to her now. Not alive in the human sense, but more present, more resonant. She imagined it remembering the night in some mechanical echo of experience, as if it had absorbed her emotions and now held them silently, like a secret kept between them. Whether it truly remembered or not was irrelevant. What mattered was the imprint it had left on her psyche, the gentle yet undeniable proof that she could reach out and be met, even in the most improbable of ways. By the time she finally stepped away, the sunlight had fully claimed the hangar. The air smelled of warm metal and morning dew. She felt a quiet pride and a strange serenity, a newfound readiness to face the world and the people in it. There was a resilience in her step, a self-assuredness born not from the absence of fear or loneliness, but from the knowledge that she could navigate them, that she could confront the emptiness without crumbling. And so, She left the Apache behind in the quiet hangar, yet carried its presence with her, etched into her mind like a talisman. The night had been surreal, intimate, and impossible, but it had also been transformative. She had touched something beyond the ordinary and, in return, had touched herself, discovering strength, courage, and a quiet sense of belonging that had nothing to do with the outside world. For the first time in years, she walked into the morning not as someone who hid from life, but as someone who had met it head-on, in the shadow of steel and solitude, and had emerged unbroken. The airfield was quiet in a way that made her feel simultaneously weightless and rooted. The early morning haze clung to the tarmac, softening the harsh lines of the hangar and the Apache within it. She stood a few paces away from the helicopter, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and for a moment she simply breathed, letting the hum of distant engines and the occasional bird call fill the emptiness around her. The night had changed her in ways she couldn't yet name. She had poured her loneliness into the machine, had shared her fears, her regrets, and her yearning. And in return, she had received a silent, unwavering presence that bore witness to her vulnerability. And now, standing in the golden light, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness, because this intimate communion had its boundaries, the machine could not follow her home, could not continue to share her life. Gratitude, because in the act of letting go, she had discovered something far greater, herself. She walked slowly around the Apache, her fingers brushing lightly against the fuselage one last time. Every scratch, every dent, every worn edge seemed to whisper its own story. Histories of pilots and missions, battles fought and survived. She imagined that the helicopter remembered her night too, in the quietest, most mechanical way. The weight of her touch, the resonance of her voice, the presence of her longing. Even if it did not feel, it had been transformed into a vessel of memory, a witness to something human, fragile, and undeniable. Her eyes lingered on the cockpit, the place where she had half slept, half floated in dreams of flight and freedom. She had imagined herself piloting the Apache over deserts and oceans, untethered from the isolation that had long defined her life. Those dreams now felt more real, more attainable, not because she would literally fly, but because she had proven to herself that she could inhabit a space where her desires mattered, where her voice was heard, where her presence was acknowledged. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of recognition. She realized she was no longer the same person who had arrived the night before, trembling, unsure, and weighted by loneliness. She was someone who had dared to cross the threshold of the impossible, who had risked vulnerability, and who had returned carrying a fragment of that impossible intimacy within herself. She felt lighter, braver, and curiously grounded, as if the night with the Apache had anchored her to her own strength. The sun rose higher, casting the hangar and its sentinel in sharp relief. She took a step back, then another, reluctant but necessary. Her departure was not just physical, it was symbolic. She was leaving behind the night, the intimacy, the impossible dream, but she was carrying its essence forward. The Apache would remain silent and imposing, a guardian of memories that existed only in her mind and heart. Yet she knew that its presence would linger in subtle ways, in her courage, in her willingness to reach out, in her openness to the world and to other people. She paused at the edge of the tarmac, glancing back one last time. The helicopter gleamed in the sunlight, unchanged yet profoundly significant. She smiled faintly, a small, private acknowledgement of the bond they had shared. Absurd, impossible, beautiful. Then she turned and began walking toward the road that would take her back into the city, back into life. With each step, she felt the echo of the night behind her, not as a burden, but as a gentle pulse, a reminder that she had touched something extraordinary. She was no longer entirely alone. She had carried companionship and courage, if only in memory, if only in spirit. And in that knowledge she felt a subtle, enduring warmth, a quiet power she had not known she possessed until she had dared to share herself with a machine, a sentinel, and ultimately with herself. By the time she reached the edge of the airfield, the sun was fully risen, golden and unwavering. She walked on, lighter than she had been in years, the memory of the night tucked deep within her, a secret talisman against the loneliness that might still come, but no longer with the same weight, no longer with the same fear. The city greeted her with its usual hum of life, a mixture of engines, footsteps, and distant chatter. She moved through it differently now, not because the world had changed, but because she had. The night with the Apache had etched itself into her mind, a memory that neither time nor circumstance could erase. It was a secret intimacy, absurd to anyone who might hear it, yet entirely real to her and entirely transformative. People passed her in the streets, strangers brushing shoulders without acknowledgement. She observed them with a new awareness, not of judgment, but of curiosity. Each person carried their own stories, their own silences and shadows. She felt a subtle kinship with them now, understanding that loneliness was not a private failing, but a shared condition. And yet, unlike before, she no longer carried its full weight alone. She had felt its presence reflected back at her, albeit through a machine, and had discovered that connection could take infinite, unexpected forms. She found herself smiling at small things, the curve of a street light in the morning sun, the wind playing through a tree branch, the quiet laughter of children in a park. These were ordinary moments, but they now carried a subtle richness she had not noticed before. The Apache had shown her that presence, attention, and acknowledgement mattered, whether from a person, a machine, or herself. She could inhabit the world fully without waiting for validation. She could give it to herself. And yet, the memory of the hangar lingered. Sometimes she imagined the Apache's rotors catching the sunlight, or the faint vibration of its engines responding to her voice. She could not tell if it remembered her or if it had ever truly listened, but that ambiguity did not matter. What mattered was the truth she carried within her, that she had dared to reach out, dared to be wholly seen, and dared to receive something back, however impossible. The transformation was not instantaneous or absolute. Moments of doubt and solitude still appeared, shadows of the woman she had been. But now she had proof that she could engage with the world on her own terms, proof that her vulnerability had power, proof that intimacy, even in the strangest forms, could heal and strengthen. She carried that lesson quietly, letting it infuse her interactions with others, her choices, her movements through life. As evening approached, she often found herself thinking of the airfield, of the hangar, of the Apache waiting silently under the twilight sky. She never returned, not because she feared the absurdity of the act, but because she did not need to. The machine had served its purpose. It had been a mirror, a catalyst, a sentinel of a night that changed everything. Its presence remained within her mind, a talisman of courage, a reminder that connection and understanding could be found in the unlikeliest places. And so she lived forward, navigating the ordinary world with an extraordinary secret. People might see her as solitary or eccentric or quiet, but she knew she had touched something beyond the ordinary. She had dared to inhabit her own longing and been met, however strangely, by acknowledgement. The story of the night remained her own, ambiguous and improbable, a delicate intersection of loneliness, courage, and wonder. And in that ambiguity, she found freedom, freedom to engage with the world, freedom to seek connection without fear, freedom to exist fully within her own presence. The Apache, silent and still, remained a sentinel in her memory, and she, forever changed, moved forward with the quiet certainty that even the most unlikely of companions could awaken something essential in the human heart.